I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange.
Hey there, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, the paranormal pop culture show. As always, I'm your host, journalist, author, researcher of weird things, Aaron Sagers, and you can also catch me on 28 Days Haunted on Netflix and Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and the Max streaming service. And hey, we're airing our 7th season currently, so check that out. And I'm excited about my guest today. We've been doing a bit of email tag for a while, trying to make this interview happen. And meanwhile, he just keeps on trucking and having more projects come out. So it just gives us even more to talk about. He is a journalist, a writer, a broadcaster, a fellow ghost host behind the popular Uncanny podcast, as well as the TV show and the book, which I have right here. And now in his 4th season, Uncanny brings the paranormal investigation to explore cases in the United States, providing witness interviews, experts who present their sides as Team Skeptic, Team Believer, and challenging listeners to decide where they lie in the debate. And not to rest too much on those laurels, he's also in the midst of a UK stage tour, Uncanny, I Know What I Saw, where he invites audience members to share their stories. Okay, his name is Danny Robins, and I'm pleased to finally bring him in to Talking Strange. Danny,
hello.
We're here.
How are you?
What's happening?
It's good.
It's,
the ghost guys are together.
I know. I'm excited. The and also the timing is I'm happy about talking to you today because just last night, correct me if I'm wrong, but just last night, the live show Uncanny I Know What I Saw had its premiere in London's West End at the prestigious Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Is that correct? Just last night?
It was very exciting. Yeah, we did our kind of West End gala night. We've been traveling all around the UK and Ireland, and then we hit the West End, the kind of glittering theatre land of London, and performed, in the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, which is said to be the most haunted theatre in the world, if you like. So there you go. And it's got some intriguing ghost stories attached to it. There's one about Joseph Grimaldi, who performed there, who was basically the father of modern clowning. He kind of invented clowning, and the whole kind of clown makeup that people have is originated with him. He apparently insisted on being buried without his head for some reason. He insists on being decapitated before he's buried, and people think that that's the reason he comes back, and they see a floating white clown face. So how's that for nightmare fuel? And then there's another amazing story about this guy Dan Leno, who was this music hall comedian, really famous kind of performer comedian of his time. And apparently he was incontinent, and he used to disguise his incontinence with lots of perfume smelling of lavender. And so now if you smell lavender in the theatre, that is this ghost wandering around that normally smelled of pee. So some just very strange and bizarre stories attached to it.
I guess, like, as opposed to the smell of brimstone or rotting flesh, as they say, is associated with evil haunts and whatnot. Lavender's less.
It's
less
preferable,
bad.
Yeah.
But then knowing that perhaps you're dealing with a ghost that is just, incontinent, I just feel bad for the ghost.
An incontinent ghost was certainly a new one on me, but yeah, no, I love it. I think traveling around the theaters, every theater has a ghost story attached to it. They're such rich places for this kind of thing, and I think there's probably lots of a skeptic would see lots of reasons for that. I think they are places that are designed to create magic, and illusion, the imagination, but also I think so many of these stories are about tragic failure, basically, like playwrights whose plays went wrong, actresses who were in love with theatre managers and it all went wrong, things like that. And every night you step out on stage, or every night we do any of this kind of thing, podcasting, TV, whatever, as a performer, you're always frightened of failure. And if you've got a ghost who's gone out there and failed for you, a couple of 100 years before, it sort of takes it out your system. It's like they're your kind of guardian angel watching down, looking out for you.
And it's certainly, it's all across the world, but especially in European and American locations, every theater has a ghost. But then I think about, okay, well, I don't know that I've seen too many ghosts fill out any census or surveys about how haunted a place is, but you do have to consider that these are locations where strong emotions are being experienced and also projected from the stage. If you're a good actor, you're not faking that emotion, you're like actually conjuring it, and the people in the audience are feeling these strong emotions associated with activity. But also, what's taking place on stage is really it's a simulation. You're recreating historic events or moments in time. So maybe on some level that's drawing in the potential activity.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it's interesting. Any area where people congregate, and you have lots and lots of people coming to it. I think, if you're interested in the idea of these things being generated by some sort of energy, or, even that amazing kind of that theory of, tulpas, of these beings created by some sort of collective act of will, which I just love as an idea. But, that sense that people could come together in some sort of that the energy, the kind of collective concentration could bring something to life. But certainly the theatre ghosts follow certain patterns. You get
Mm.
lots of, there's loads of grey ladies appearing in these Victorian theatres. And again, I just wonder how much of that is us interpreting things in certain ways. You kind of expect certain things in Victorian buildings, in Georgian buildings. You expect to see ghosts from that era. But, I mean, we've been to some really modern theatres. There was one story we were told in a place that was really quite modern, that had a cinema and a theatre attached to the same building. And in that cinema, they had a ghost couple that started appearing just in the last few weeks there. And it was that point at the end of a movie where the credits are playing, just this couple sitting in the cinema. And then as the lights went up, they disappeared. And there was no way they could have got past the ushers who were blocking the only exit. But the thing that I loved most about that story was that the first time the couple appeared was during a screening of John Wick 4, which I just thought was the best beginning to a modern ghost story. That idea of it, it was a cold, dark night watching John Wick 4, as Keanu appeared, the couple disappeared. I love the fact that, for so long, ghost stories were kind of, the preserve, certainly in the UK, the preserve kind of, Victorians and smoky streets and that sort of thing. But, I think modern ghosts that inhabit our world and use our tech and kind of, just inhabit our lives. I think that to me feels so much more believable and so much more real.
Yeah, it cracks me up because people do talk about, the Victorian ghost or the Civil War ghost and I kind of wonder, like, are we so focused on seeing these ancient specters or very old specters at least that we might be missing out on a ghost from the 80s wearing, bright neon clothing or parachute pants and carrying around a trapper keeper or whatever. And we're just like, well, it's New York, it's London, whatever. It's like just some guy that's rocking it retro.
Yeah, but I think we bring so much of ourselves to it, don't we, in how we interpret these
Yeah.
things. And I remember asking somebody one time who'd studied this, what kind of ghosts did the Victorians see? Because we see Victorian ghosts. What did they see? And apparently they saw Tudor ghosts. So, you have this kind of concept, like it's certainly in Britain, we live largely in Victorian buildings. I live in a Victorian terraced house. It's one of the most common types of house here. So if something strange and anomalous happens in your house, that's where your mind runs to. But who knows? I mean, absolutely. I mean, and would you be able to tell the difference between Victorian clothing, Edwardian clothing, even like kind of 1940s clothing potentially in that split second? I mean, God, you could be seeing somebody from the 80s, as you say, and misinterpret it as Victorian, I think, in that kind of split second. So,
Yeah.
really intriguing.
Well, speaking of clothing, so let me ask, the red sweater, shirt, rain slicker, you're living a life of red now. I want to get into so many other things, but I do want to get the origin of the red because it's very much a part of your brand now. I don't know that you can publicly wear any other
Yes,
color.
it's in my contract. And it's a timely question actually, because a lot of the origins, particularly the red coat, are linked to the film Don't Look Now. And very
Right.
sadly, we lost Donald Sutherland just so recently, didn't we? Just a few days ago. And that film for me is one of the greatest movies of all time, let alone horror movies. I just think it's the most wonderful film. I was lucky enough to sit down for lunch recently with the man who wrote it,
Mm.
Alan Scott, who wrote many amazing things, co-created The Queen's Gambit, wrote Castaway, but wrote that movie, and it's just such an affecting, powerful movie. And I've always been struck by that potency, that power of the in that film, it's the little girl, the little figure moving through in the red coat. But I mean, I love red. It's a color I've always been drawn to. Read into that what you will. People who analyze these kind of things. But I had that red coat. I bought that red coat because I liked it. And then when we were doing the photo shoot for Uncanny, I just wore it. And then now everyone says, "What's the significance? What's the symbolism?" And I'm like, "Well, it's kind of don't look now, but it's also kind of it was my coat, and that's what I was wearing."
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I'm drawn to it. There's something, it's a horror color, isn't it? Like black, red, and white are horror colors, basically.
Yeah.
So if you insinuate yourself into a landscape wearing red, you stand out in a kind of creepy way.
I on my end, for instance, this paranormal caught on camera show that we've been doing for a handful of years, like I've been wearing the same outfit, and it's a blue kind of plaid shirt and a blue blazer, very professorial, and I wore it because I enjoyed that outfit. But then I was doing 26 episode seasons or whatever, and now I hang it up and I put it away in between seasons. It's the closest thing to a Batman costume that I
It's
have, where I'm
funny,
just
isn't it?
like,
I love that. I do think of them as superhero costumes, these
yeah.
kind of things that we just become our outfit. I've got this problem at the moment that my red coat is showing a few signs of wear and tear, and they've stopped making them. They've discontinued that type. So I'm currently trying to persuade the company to see if they'll make me another one, and sort of scouring eBay as well. But yeah, I don't know. My advice now, actually, moving forward, is if you find something you like, buy lots of them, because you will want that as they wear out, you'll want more of them.
Well, I think with the success of Uncanny, you can probably get someone to bring that coat back, and let's talk about that a little bit, because before Uncanny, the podcast, uh, you had Haunted, you had the Battersea Poltergeist, you did the Witch Farm podcast drama, 222, a ghost story. You've had so much that's been building up to this, and I want to talk about little Danny growing up in Newcastle, right? Like
Yeah, up in the
the
north of England.
and you talk about it in the book, but you were a kid that grew up reading the Usborne Book of Ghosts, right? And
Yeah.
what was like the origin? What was in the DNA of like little spooky Danny before it became the job, the movies, the TV
Yeah.
shows, the formative stuff?
So I think a big part of this for me is growing up in a belief-free house. I was brought up by a mum who was really ardently atheist, having been brought up a Catholic and
Right.
decided she didn't want to do that anymore. And yet kind of going to my grandparents and seeing all of these kind of totems of belief, like the kind of the pictures of the Pope and monks and nuns. And we had like, my mum had an uncle and aunt who were a monk and a nun, so it was that sense of, whenever you're kind of told by your parents not to do something, you're drawn to it, aren't you? It was belief became the forbidden thing. And I always say, like, some people would have found God and I found ghosts. And I think, I was just so interested by the idea that there was something more out there and that there might be a club I wasn't a part of. And I think, I don't know, I was just drawn to ghosts from an early age. I think I was fascinated by detective stories. I think I was fascinated by the idea of wanting to solve mysteries, the unknown. I mean, I was voraciously reading Agatha Christie from my early teens as well. I love the detective story, and I think ghosts are the ultimate detective story. And like I remember going to watch The Woman in Black, the play version of that classic novel,
Mhm.
and being so struck by that and by the power of being scared, I guess, as well. I think there's something quite powerful for kids, I think, about being scared in a sort of controlled environment. It's why we like sort of shows like a Doctor Who or something like that. Like you shows about aliens, shows about ghosts and stuff. It's scary but kind of intriguing and it draws you in. So I think that was a really big part of it for me, and certainly reading lots of those kind of books like the classic Usborne World of the Unknown. I don't know how well known that is in the States, but here it was a kind of real seminal book of a certain kind of late 70s 80s kind of era. And then I mean, the other huge thing in my life that I think kind of really, really ramped up my interest in ghosts was in my early 20s, where I totally believed I was about to die, and it was truly horrible. I was in my parents' house, laid out on the floor in the bathroom, totally convinced I was having a heart attack. My heart was just pounding, pounding, pounding from my chest. I could literally see angels coming to get me, and I think now I realize I was hallucinating, but it felt very, very real. And it turned out that it wasn't a heart attack; it was a panic attack. It was something that some people watching this, listening, will have experienced. not life-threatening, but really, for those of us who had it, horrible, absolutely horrible. And it gave me this profound fear of death for a good year or more after that. Just every second of every day, I thought I was about to die. And I just literally couldn't function. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't socialize. I couldn't study. I kind of, sort of just spent, every day a kind of total mess, really. And it kind of lingers in me to this day, I think, that fear of death. And so I'm so drawn to ghosts because they are the opposite of death. They're the possibility that we do go on. And I think that's, the paradox, really, isn't it? That we get frightened by ghosts, but they offer us this incredible optimism as well. So I think for me, that was a catalyst that drew me more and more into it. And I think, probably if we're honest, actually, a lot of people listening to this will probably, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that's your skin in the game, like, that sort of incentive of maybe there is that incredible life after death. So all those things fed in, really. And then, yeah, I found myself talking to a friend of mine at one point a few years ago, and she told me that she'd seen a ghost, and it was just so utterly real and compelling. And it was like talking to someone who'd experienced an accident or a crime, just the way she described it felt so kind of forensically clear and vivid and shocking. And I remember thinking that our friends would react to her in very, very different ways. And some would be irritated by her, some would mock her, some would, laugh at her, some would believe her. And I thought, if you take that and you put it into a couple, what would happen to that relationship? And so that was the origins of my play 222, A Ghost Story. And as soon as I had that idea, I started researching more and more, asking people for their experiences. And as I got these experiences coming in, that's where all the podcasts came from. I just realized there was this kind of treasure trove of amazing experiences that people had been sitting on and keeping to themselves. And I wanted to kind of somehow do something about this.
Yeah, and it is fascinating going through the various projects because of the different spins that you put on it, and each of them are very approachable, even though they're formatted differently. And I have to say that even some of the childhood anecdotes, it was almost like we're pretty much close in age, and the childhood anecdotes of going through a family member's house that was deeply Catholic and seeing the tortured, horrific Jesus portrait, like
Yeah.
that scared me more than the notion
Oh,
of ghosts at one
yeah.
point. While I urgently was trying to get to the toilet as a young boy, like then seeing tortured Jesus like that,
Yeah.
I relate to so much of that. And we didn't really have Usborne's. It's since made its way over here, but we had, for me, it was like the Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown, books like that, that like
I
got
think
its hooks into us.
all of us have those moments, I think, from our childhood, those kind of vivid images that stick with us. There's that very famous image of a woman who allegedly spontaneously combusted. And as I say that, you'll know what I'm talking about. Lots of people of a certain age will know that it's an image of her leg, and it's just, it's so, like it haunts your nightmares, basically. And I think, all of those old images of what people believe are ghosts on camera, caught on camera, just it was that fired my imagination.
Yeah. With the stage show in particular, and I don't know if I'll get out to see it before the end of July, but it's fascinating because from what I understand is you are pulling the questions from the audience and encouraging people to scan QR codes and submit their stories and share that with you. And then Kieran O'Keefe, who I'm familiar with,
Mm.
is on there as well. And there's this balance of consistency, and yet every night it's a different show. Is that
Well, so
correct?
we look at two cases in the show, which are cases that we've never featured on the podcast or the TV series or in the book. So they're kind of unique to the live show. And we bring them to life in a very theatrical way. I think your average podcast live is people sitting around recording. This is kind of much, much more theatrical than that. It's, we're using lights and sound and video projections and flying props and illusions to bring these stories to life. And you'll see bits of video of the witnesses talking about their cases. So it's those two cases are the same every night. That's consistent. But I think the thing about all the work I do is that I perceive it as a conversation, and it's one half of a conversation. And so I tell you about these things, and then I throw it open for your questions and theories. And in the live show, we do that there and then in the moment, so people can offer us their questions and theories, and our experts talk about it. We've got Kieran O'Keefe and Evelyn Hollow who feature on the Uncanny TV series, if anyone's seen that. And And then the things that change every night are that we talk about local ghost stories. Everywhere we go, we look at stories specific to the area, but also we ask people for their ghost stories as well. So at the end of the show, people have this chance to just tell us their stories. And, I feel so privileged that you go around and you hear these amazing moments in people's lives, these little life-changing moments that could be terrifying or they could be incredibly moving. People talking about, feeling that they've had contact with people that they've loved and lost. So yeah, it's an amazing thing actually, and I love the community that's built around the show. That the social media that's sprung around, particularly Uncanny, but all of the podcasts really has just been so lovely because it encompasses believers and skeptics and everybody in the middle as well in this kind of fairly unique way, I think, on social media that they're not arguing and hating each other. They kind of agree to disagree.
Yeah, and with the team skeptic, team believer kind of dichotomy that you have with the book, with the shows, with everything that you're doing now, or a lot of the stuff that you're doing right now, I like it. I do appreciate that you're doing something that is allowing someone to ask the questions. So you're not necessarily forcing belief onto anyone, but you're not forcing cynicism either. It's almost like team skeptic, team believer, I like, although it's a little bit more broad than that because skepticism is asking questions but being open-minded. You're not being cynical, which is to say closed-minded. And I think that that is part of the appeal of Uncanny because ultimately people want to be heard, and they want to be heard by open-minded people and not made to be feel like they're crazy. Is that something that you have found?
Well,
I think.
totally. I think absolutely. I think for a period of time. I mean, there was in the past there was a period when ghosts, haunted houses were front page news. That if we look back at the Enfield haunting in the 70s, I mean, certainly even before that to Borley Rectory, one of the great cases here, that it was absolutely front page news back in the 30s and 40s. Um, for a long time, though, I think in recent times we've not really known how to talk about these stories. I think in the UK it became the paranormal was packaged up very much as just pure entertainment. It was the kind of that era of sort of the kind of Most Haunted and shows like that, which were great shows, really brilliant, entertaining shows. But I think the paranormal came to be perceived as something. It was entertainment. You had mediums, you had kind of running around screaming, that kind of thing. And I think there was a group of people who did not feel comfortable telling their stories within that format, and people who were wary about how to talk about it, worried about how they'd be judged. Perhaps people who felt that they would be laughed at or mocked. And I think Uncanny has sought to create a safe space where everybody can talk about these stories. And so a lot of the people who talk to me haven't really talked to even close friends or even sometimes their partner about what's happened to them. And it's amazing and a lovely thing that they have that confidence to do it. And I think, I've loved the broad church that we create, the fact that skeptics and believers come together. And I think I always say that these are detective stories and you can enjoy it in your own way. And if you are a believer, it's very much a whodunit. You're trying to make sense of the haunting and who the ghost is. And if you're a skeptic, it's a howdunit. You can look at environmental factors and the psychology and all that sort of thing. And I think creating a thing where those two camps can enjoy it in their own way. And skeptics think this is a show for skeptics and believers think this is a show for believers. I love that, and I'm somewhere in the middle, kind of torn and stuck between these two things, I think. And I think probably a lot of people who listen are.
I I think sometimes something that has served me well through my journeys doing this is that I'm not presenting myself as like a uh as a certain stereotype of like a medium, and I'm not a medium, and I'm not presenting myself as a stereotype of a paranormal investigator, and I've never even really sold myself as a paranormal investigator, more researcher and journalist, and I just try to be goofy nerd that's willing to talk to you about this strange stuff, and hopefully the journalistic side, getting people to open up. Do you think that you being who you are and also having the ability to be a comedian, to be affable, to be just like a likable person has allowed people to feel more comfortable opening up with you as opposed to showing up and going strong into like, all right, we're gonna talk about the paranormal, that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you'll be very aware of this, but I think there is a real strand in the paranormal of a kind of almost like an aggression. You get, I see a lot of photos of these kind of largely male ghost hunting groups who dress like paramilitaries, and kind of going around, and even that word ghost hunt, like it's interesting. And I think that ghost busting as well, there's a lot of kind of quite aggressive talk towards ghosts. So I think it is interesting to have a kind of different type of dialogue. And I think that term, creating a safe space, I think, and just making people feel comfortable they can talk about. And I think using humor has been important for me, certainly. And I think it's a natural instinct for me, because I was a teenage comedian. I did stand up from about age 16, and I wrote comedy for many, many years before I kind of got into what I'm doing now. And I think you kind of need it in a way. It could be a very serious and dark subject, the idea of death and loss and so on. So I think you need that lightness to balance out the dark. And certainly in my play 222, I absolutely use humor and scares as kind of uppers and downers almost. You're going to scare someone, then you kind of lull them into a sense of security with a joke, and then back to scares. But I don't know. Look, I think there's so many different ways to approach this, and I think what both you and I are doing is kind of, opening up this subject that so many people are fascinated about. And I think, certainly for a time, I think the paranormal was not taken seriously by, kind of mainstream broadcasters, by a lot of the media, basically. And I think, I love the fact that now, we could talk about this, and that we're making these shows. Both of us are making these shows that are taken seriously and kind of, that mean a lot to people. I think there's so many people out there who want to talk about this subject, and someone came up to me after a show recently, and she was like, "Why haven't we been talking about this for so long?" And she was like, "I remember all those shows from the 70s and the 80s, but we haven't been talking about this for ages, and it's great that we are now." And I think both of us are part of this kind of paranormal boom at the moment. I think there's a real renaissance of talking about this subject. And again, I just welcome that, because I think it's the biggest question in the history of our universe. Every religion ever founded has been trying to make sense of what happens to us when we die. Are we alone? What's our place in the universe? And the paranormal is a different route to those same answers.
And even having like that's kind of secular, spooky approach, that we're not talking about God or religion. Not that, people can believe what they wish to believe, but sort of this common denominator of just, yeah, secular spooky. I think that contributes to the approachability of it, that you're not doing something where it's like, I'm Danny, and let me tell you about religion and my best friend Jesus. You're
Yeah.
just you're inviting people in to tell the stories. Do you think that
Yeah,
makes it?
it's very driven by the people, I think. And I think a lot of paranormal broadcasting has been very driven by places. People go to a place and investigate it. I mean, I don't do that as much. My thing is about sort of sitting in a room with someone and kind of looking into the whites of their eyes, and experiencing a moment kind of in retrospect, I guess. Like most of the things we talk about. I mean, every so often we go to somewhere where there is a current haunting. And actually, the last episode of the Uncanny USA series will be me going to a house and investigating somewhere that somebody feels they are still being haunted. But most of the cases we've looked at have happened in the past, and sometimes quite a while in the past. And so I think it's a moment in someone's life. It's a sort of truly unsettling, strange moment in somebody's life, and it's about trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, and I
I've
know.
just realized my laptop is unplugged and I need to plug it in because
Oh,
it's about to run out of battery. Sorry, the
well,
wire slipped out. There we go. Seamlessly done. There we go. Is
yeah,
that
well
on?
done. That was smooth.
There we go.
The I'm actually realizing the same thing right here.
Aha, there we go.
But yeah, for the Uncanny US episodes, you have a number of experts, including Jeff Belanger, who's a good friend of mine and of this show. But I know you've talked about this in some of the other interviews you've done, but this American tour of you exploring, the phenomena in the States. First off, I guess, as a kid that was also like a pop culture kid, was it exciting exploring some of the settings of many like ghost movie tropes and whatnot, such as Ghostbusters, Poltergeist, and like that, when you stepped foot in the States on this mission?
Yeah, totally. I think this series came from two places. It came from realizing that I was getting a lot of messages from the States, lots of people sending me their stories, and Uncanny, was international now, that our listenership was from, all over the world, but certainly a lot of people in the States. And I think the other thing was I'd been out to LA for my play. We did a production of 222 in the Armanson Theatre in LA, and just talking to people over there so much about, like obviously LA is the kind of the capital of horror movies, and just talking about, the American take on the paranormal, the American take on horror, and I think there's so many similarities between how Brits and Americans view the paranormal. And I would argue that both of us have a similar problem with death, that, we are not a culture that is at ease with death. I think
Right.
there are other cultures around the world that are much more at ease or sort of in tune with death. And I think where ghosts are much more about kind of a sort of a bond with your ancestors and something comforting, that idea of sort of setting a place for your ancestor at the table on the Day of the Dead in Mexico, those kind of things. But I think we're freaked out by it. And so our ghosts are scary. They come at you, they're kind of vicious, lots of poltergeists. And but then there are also real differences, and I think, Brits tend to live in older homes, and I think there's a lot more chance for kind of benign hauntings by former residents of that house, kind of slightly more comforting, cozy hauntings. I think, I think collectively the perception of American hauntings that they're often more violent, they're to do with murders and serial killers, penitentiaries, asylums. That's sort of where you go ghost hunting traditionally in the States, I think. But, when I buried under it, I just found lots of really interesting people who felt, like the difference between an uncanny witness in Britain and an uncanny witness in the States didn't feel that big at all. It was a different accent. These were kind of intelligent, articulate, interesting people who'd had extraordinary things happen to them and wanted to talk about it, wanted to try and make sense of it. And I just felt, incredibly excited to go on this kind of amazing road trip around the States. And I went to the Mojave Desert. I went to rural Georgia. I went to Montecito, that kind of, celebrity hotspot of California, the wilds of Northern California. And, we have stories from Alaska and Missouri, all over the place. And these very human tales. And also this series took us into some slightly different realms. We've got, classic haunted house cases, but also we looked at Bigfoot, which I know is something that obsesses the American psyche, but was something that we hadn't tapped into those realms of cryptozoology, that study of species that may or may not exist. We hadn't done that yet. And we did a classic UFO case as well, the Berkshire UFO.
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting, and I think it's been very popular over here in the UK, and I hope, I mean, I understand our American listenership has increased with it as well, but I hope that when Americans listen to it, they feel like it sort of makes sense as well. And I think, I never wanted to come over and try and make, an American show, or kind of, try and pretend I was some kind of a, American guy. I wanted to kind of do my own perspective on this, come in and do my take on it, but with, the stories that sort of felt like they, a lot of our stories are really kind of fascinatingly tapping into kind of moments in American pop culture, moments in American psyche. There's, one case that sort of taps into the Challenger disaster and talks about the kind of test pilots, a potential ghost of a test pilot in the Mojave Desert, which takes you into really interesting territory. We go into like voodoo in New Orleans in one case, so I feel like I've been learning a lot as well on my journeys.
Yeah, well, and obviously with a younger country, but also such a cultural diversity and such a large landmass, there are these signature items to the American ghost story, but also just a wide swath of different elements to it. But also, it seems like a lot of our ghost stories, our hauntings, can be connected to unresolved traumas
Yeah.
of the American psyche. Colonizers, indigenous
Mm.
people, slavery, things that even nearly 300 years on we haven't quite processed. Things like
Yeah, yeah.
that.
No, we looked at one really interesting case in Missouri, which was an area that had had a lot of kind of trauma in the past of Native American people being dispossessed, but also slavery and sort of, lots of very violent skirmishes around the time of the Civil War. And we had a really interesting debate about, it was a brand new house built by our
Yeah.
witnesses. And, it was that idea of where does this haunting come from? Is it the building? Is it the people? Is it the land itself? Can land have a kind of trace memory? And yeah, really interesting. But I think, you know, there's certainly a view of ghosts as trauma that needs to be processed, kind of unfinished moments in history, sort of things that were cut off before their time, and things that need to kind of come back and try and make sense of themselves. And I think, that's a really interesting idea of that.
Is there a next level of creepiness to exploring UFOs and Bigfoot? I mean, for me, it's a whole other level of creep factor because you are dealing with, when you think about a ghost, at least you're dealing with something that you in theory believe had once existed in this
Mm-hmm.
corporeal state. But, Bigfoot, it's not human. UFOs, definitely not humans. Like, that's a different level of scare factor for me. How about you?
Yeah, well, I think I've always been most scared by what I find most real. The horror movies I love are not the ones with loads of CGI. The ones that feel really real, like the Babadook, I would cite as being a movie that just plunges you into that world where you're just not sure if it's in the protagonist's head or actually paranormal and really terrifying. And so for me, I mean, Bigfoot got scary when it felt very real. I think I went into this thinking, Bigfoot, it's probably an urban legend, probably a fairy tale. I mean, it can't really be real, can it? And then I went out and I talked to these guys, these Native American guys up in the wilds of Northern California, in this amazing wilderness landscape where, they were saying there's places out there where human beings have never set foot. It's
Yeah.
that remote. I remember going past a road sign which just said end of the road. It was coming up, and that's literally the end of the road. That's to the point where human beings couldn't get any further. And hearing their stories and hearing the kind of normalization of, it's not a belief in Bigfoot. They're not talking about believing in Bigfoot any more than we're talking about believing in like a table or a chair or birds outside our window. They just think that this is something, a fact of life, and that everybody in that community knows somebody who's seen a Bigfoot or has seen one themselves. And when it's described to you in those terms, you're like, well, who am I to come and tell you that Bigfoot doesn't exist? And actually, you can kind of contemplate it when you see that landscape. You can believe that things could stay hidden there. And I find it the most lovely and romantic idea that in this world that we're spoiling and polluting and sort of bending to our destructive will, that actually maybe somewhere out there is this species that has escaped detection and is living their own life, doing their own thing, and only occasionally comes into contact with us, but in a way that's just kind of remote and distant enough that it can never, it's intangible.
You grew up with an atheist mom, and but she had been Catholic, and I grew up in a Catholic household, even though I'm not particularly religious now. And yet doing this stuff, talking to people, exploring these things has weirdly made me feel, I guess you could say more spiritual, but more tapped into the universe at large. It's almost like, in a way, doing this has provided some sense of fulfillment that I never got from the religious upbringing. How about for you? On all these explorations, has it started scratching some sort of deeper spiritual itch or made you feel like connected to something bigger? Not necessarily religious, but you know what I mean? Just something
Yeah,
bigger.
I do. And, I mean, religion, God, the paranormal, all these things are ways of trying to make sense of something, aren't they? And of trying to explain something. And, like we could get kind of philosophical and talk about sort of, consciousness or, energy and all those sort of things. But it's trying to make sense of the mysteries of our world, I think. And, when I do the live show traveling around the country, I do feel there is a sort of almost semi-religious quality to these moments. I think about like the Quaker movement where you would just kind of talk when you felt the spirit come to you, and I think people feel this great desire to share these things in these moments and to talk about these extraordinary experiences they've had. And I'm struck also by people sometimes telling me that they feel that they've seen a ghost, but it wasn't the ghost they wanted. The ghost they really
Mm.
wanted was somebody close to them, a father or a brother or a lover, somebody that they'd lost. And I think, there's this huge collective desire for this. I think, I sometimes say that I think, that even if you don't think ghosts are real, you secretly wish that they were. You kind of, I think all of us deep down have this kind of this need for this, for this to be real, I think. And I feel that I'm never quite sure what I believe. I feel torn. I say I'm a skeptic who wants to believe, but I bloody hope this is true. I just, I want it so much. And I think, yeah, there's a power to this, and I feel like I've been on this journey. I think if you hear my earlier podcast, like if you listen to Haunted, the thing I did, I think back in 2016, I think you hear a more skeptical me, and I think being exposed to these stories and not having answers for them, and not feeling that I can come to simple conclusions and feeling that there is just a mass of loose threads and tangled wires. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I want it so much, and I definitely feel like it has that religious quality, that kind of, it unleashes a kind of, endorphin filled, huge optimism at heart, doesn't it?
Hmm. And belief is, I say it all the time. I don't know what I believe, and belief is such a big word. It's like you're planting a flag in something and saying, this is my belief. But, having thoughts, ideas, it's that leaves more flexibility, and that's kind of where I try to operate. Is there,
I think it's a good thing as well. I think it's really
yeah,
important to say in this day and age that it's okay to change your mind as well. I think we live in a culture where, it's almost like you can't change your mind anymore.
right.
You say what you think and then you've got to stick to it, and you hate everyone who doesn't think like you. And someone comes out and says something, stupid and dumb when they're 18, and then you hold them to it. And that's like, we're never going to forgive them. That's you defined for life. And actually, what a terrible view of the world. I mean, let's acknowledge that human beings can have an opinion and change their opinion and go back and forth between different things. And when I, created those kind of hashtags of Team Believer and Team Skeptic for this show, the idea wasn't that it was oppositional or confrontational. The idea was that you could be both these things at different points, and be feel one way for one case and another way for a different case, and maybe you change your opinion several times in an episode. But I just think, everything's so black and white in our world. It's so polarized. We're encouraged to always be opposites. And actually, it's okay to be in that kind of gray zone, and to say, I don't know, and to keep an open mind and to listen without judgment to these stories. And I think, we're also, human beings are really always encouraged to kind of, look for answers and to try and define this narrative and make sense of things. And I think sometimes we witness things that maybe we can't make sense of. And occasionally we have to just step back and say, this is magic. These are these strange moments of magic. And whether you believe that it's generated by our brains or by our environments, by the dead coming back to life, or by energy force within us, or by aliens or Bigfoot, whatever we feel is causing these strange anomalous moments in our lives, maybe we should just kind of accept it and roll with it, and revel in these moments.
Yeah, embrace the unknown, the high
Yeah.
strangeness, the strange and unusual. Is there an appetite to explore, you've now kind of taken the podcast to the States. Is there an appetite to explore other cultures that are, different from, the Western world? Go to, Asia, explore Japanese folklore and ghost stories and whatnot.
I think so. I've been lucky enough that my play 222 has been translated into quite a few different languages around the world now, and I've seen how different cultures tackle the themes of ghosts, the themes of the play. And yeah, I am quite fascinated because I think, clearly this is a massive itch to scratch for the entire world. Everywhere in the world has a view on this, and I think you could go to any bar, any bus, any home in the world and find, you're striking up a conversation with someone about, do ghosts exist, and everybody would have an opinion on it. So yeah, I think I would love to do that. And absolutely, Asia is a really intriguing place where I think there's a very, different approach to ghosts in many ways to our culture within Western Europe and North America. But yeah, I'm now getting stories from all around the place, and I think maybe the key is that Uncanny, the next Uncanny series could be an international thing. I can kind of
Yeah.
a concoction, a kind of cornucopia of stories from all around.
Any plans to bring the Uncanny, I Know What I Saw stage show to the US?
Oh God, I would love to. I would absolutely love to. That would be a dream. And I think the thing I find hard at the moment is gauging just how well known the show is in the States. I mean, I've had some lovely moments, like when I arrived in Georgia to make the Uncanny USA series. I rocked up at Atlanta Airport and we're picking up the hire car, and the guy behind the hire car desk goes, "I love Uncanny," and then he's turning to his friends and going, "This is the guy I was telling you about, man." And so that's lovely, and I know that there is a sort of certain awareness of it, and some people will have seen the TV series. I think it's available on BBC Select, and I think Amazon over there, and BritBox, and there's different ways people can access it. But I'm under no illusions that it's as popular in the States as it is in the UK. So, but I hope that might grow, and I would love it. I was a kid who always wanted to be in a band, always wanted to be a rock star. I'm totally unmusical. I can't even clap in time. It's embarrassing. But I'm kind of living my rock star dreams right now, touring around. We've done nearly 80 dates around the UK and Ireland, and so yeah, God, I mean, bring it on. I'd love to make it to the States.
It's a great, I mean, I'm not musically inclined whatsoever, and I've managed to be a fairly adequate writer and storyteller. But I find like just like there are people that love a certain band or may love a sports team or Star Wars or Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, whatever it might be. The paranormal is a fandom, and
Hmm.
it is people are looking for this tribe, and yet I feel like there's something even more intimately personal about it because you're bringing them stories about what potentially might be going on in the universe or what happens after we die, and so people connect with that. So it does make sense that you're going to have these fans over in the US as well.
I think it feels like it counts, doesn't it? Like it feels like it makes sense to us. Like, it's not just, it's not like just being into like the Avengers or Harry Potter or something.
Yeah.
Like, the paranormal really counts because it's trying to make sense of our universe and it's answering these big questions. And the older you get, maybe the more fascinated you are because you're creeping closer in proximity to death. So I think so, and I think I love the idea of this way that podcasts particularly, I think, but I mean also TV shows, but I think a podcast is a particular relationship that you forge with it. It's very intimate. You've got it in your ears and all these kind of intimate moments of jogging or commuting or doing the washing up in your kitchen. And I think it can feel like a friend. And I think, we first came out with Battersea Poltergeist, my first BBC show, in the height of when we were locked down during COVID. And I think we were lonely, we were missing friends, and at that moment, that podcast felt like a friend to some people. And I think, what I've seen on social media and growing around the shows I make is that idea of people bonding. And people I know have like WhatsApp groups and Zoom
Yeah.
meetings, getting together and talking about the cases. And, and then now we're doing these live shows and people are coming and bonding, meeting together in public. And, I love all that. I just think, as somebody who makes stuff, the best thing that you could say about this thing is that it brings people together and makes the world feel a little bit smaller and less daunting and less scary.
Yeah, ultimately, again, I don't necessarily think it matters what a person, I mean, it matters, but it's less about what a person believes and more about the story itself and the power of story, but what it says about us as a culture, us as like, humans moving through this world. That's the real power, I think, of the ghost story.
Yeah, and look, there's a reason why we're still talking about this, isn't there? I mean, we're
Yeah.
not sitting in bars and debating the existence of unicorns or pixies, but we are talking about ghosts still. And I think, either they exist or we collectively as human beings need these stories, and a skeptic would argue that we need it as a kind of comfort blanket or sort of barrier
Hmm.
between us and death, and that it's how we process death, and a believer would absolutely argue that there's a huge weight of evidence. And if you look across the thousands of years that we've been talking about this, that we're describing these cases in very similar terms every time. If you look at a poltergeist case and you read accounts of alleged poltergeist activity from back in like Viking times, and you're reading the same kind of sense of a progression in the poltergeist case from what people talk about now. So, either this is real or it's something that we have created as human beings because we need it. And I think, either way, it's going nowhere. This is a subject we're going to be talking about forevermore, I feel.
I would agree with that. Well, Danny, you've been incredibly gracious with your time. I appreciate speaking with you, and so I'm going to wrap this up and hang out on the other side for a second so I could properly say goodbye to you. But it's been a joy, and I feel like reading your book, listening to the podcast, very much pun intended, like a kindred spirit in so many ways. Because I'm like, yep, I agree. Like he's hitting on this thing exactly. Like I feel like that as well. So the relatability of it is just so enjoyable.
Oh, well, that's such a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the chat as well. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you. Well, my guest is Danny Robins. The book is Into the Uncanny. It is available now. The podcast is Uncanny. Latest season posting wherever you check out your podcast. The TV show Uncanny is available on BBC Select and Apple TV, and the stage show is happening throughout July in the United Kingdom. And you can keep up with all the stuff that he is doing at DannyRobins.com. And for the foreseeable future, I'm Aaron Sagers. This has been Talking Strange. Until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.